When I first moved into Willow Creek, I thought I'd found the perfect place to call home. The neighborhood was beautiful, clean streets, colorful gardens, and friendly neighbors waving hello as you passed by. Everything seemed so peaceful, like a scene straight out of a postcard. My husband and I were thrilled to finally settle down here after years of saving up. We imagined barbecues in the backyard, lazy Sunday mornings, and quiet evenings on the porch watching the sunset. But little did I know, there was something lurking beneath the surface of this picture-perfect community that would soon turn my life upside down. One day, while sorting through some old boxes in my storage unit, a small building at the edge of our property, I noticed a piece of paper stuck to the door. It was a letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, neatly typed and signed with an official stamp. At first glance, it looked harmless enough, but as I read through it, my heart sank. According to the HOA, they had decided that my private storage unit wasn't being used efficiently. Instead of letting it sit idle, they wanted to share it with other members of the community. They even went so far as to say it was for the greater good of everyone living in Willow Creek. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This storage unit wasn't just a random shed. It was mine. I had spent months organizing it, stacking boxes carefully, labeling everything so I could find what I needed when I needed it. Inside were family heirlooms passed down from my grandparents, photo albums filled with memories, tools I used for fixing things around the house, and countless other items that meant something to me. How could they think it was okay to take over something so personal? I marched over to the HOA office the next morning, determined to put an end to this nonsense. When I arrived, Mrs. Wexler, the president of the HOA, greeted me with her usual polite smile. She asked me to sit down, but I refused. I held up the letter and demanded answers. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking with frustration. "You can't just take over my property." Mrs. Wexler didn't seem fazed by my anger. In fact, she acted like I was overreacting. With a calm tone, she explained that the HOA board had voted unanimously to allow residents access to underutilized spaces within the community, and apparently, my storage unit fell into that category. She tried to reassure me, saying, "Don't worry, we'll make sure nothing valuable gets disturbed. You can still use it whenever you need to." But her words only made me angrier. Nothing valuable. Did she have any idea how much those boxes meant to me? Sure, maybe I didn't go into the storage unit every single day, but that didn't mean it was empty or unimportant. It was my space, paid for and maintained by me. The fact that they thought they could waltz in and decide its fate without even consulting me felt completely wrong. As I left the HOA office that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Something about their attitude told me they weren't going to back down easily, and deep down, I knew this fight was about more than just a storage unit. It was about respect, boundaries, and standing up for myself in a place where everyone else seemed to play by their own rules. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized I had two choices: let them walk all over me or find a way to fight back. But how do you stand up to an entire organization that seems to hold all the power? I didn't have the answer yet, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to roll over without a fight. The days following my confrontation with Mrs. Wexler were a blur of frustration and disbelief. I kept replaying the conversation in my mind, trying to figure out how things had spiraled so quickly out of control. How could they think it was acceptable to take over something that belonged to me? It wasn't just about the storage unit. It was about the principle. They hadn't even asked for permission or given me a chance to object. Instead, they'd made their decision behind closed doors, assuming I wouldn't put up a fight. But then reality hit. Neighbors started showing up at my storage unit like it was some kind of public locker room. One morning, I opened the door to find a man unloading a pile of Christmas decorations into the corner. He nodded politely as if he owned the place. "Thanks for letting us use this," he said before walking away. Letting them use it? I wanted to scream, but instead, I stood frozen, too stunned to respond. Later that afternoon, another neighbor arrived with a bulky treadmill. She clearly didn't want cluttering her garage anymore. She didn't bother knocking on my front door or asking if it was okay. She simply wheeled it inside and left without a word. By the end of the week, my once organized space was a chaotic mess of boxes, bags, and random items that had nothing to do with me. Each time someone came by, I felt more violated, more powerless. I tried locking the door one evening, hoping to regain some sense of control. If they thought they could barge in whenever they pleased, they had another thing coming. But my small act of rebellion only made matters worse. The next morning, I found a formal warning taped to my front door. It was written in the same cold, official tone as the original letter. Asterisk failure to comply with HOA regulations will result in penalties, asterisk penalties. For protecting my own property. It was absurd. Mark noticed my growing frustration and tried to reason with me. "It's not worth it," he said one night as we sat at the kitchen table. "We don't even use half the stuff in there anyway. Why not just let it go?" His words stung because part of me knew he was right. Some of the boxes hadn't been touched in years. But it wasn't about whether I used them or not. It was about being treated fairly. If I gave in now, what would stop them from taking over other parts of my life? That's when I realized something important. The HOA wasn't just targeting my storage unit. They were testing me, seeing how far they could push before I snapped. And the worst part was, they weren't doing it quietly. Word had spread around the neighborhood, and people were talking. Some neighbors avoided eye contact when I passed by, while others gave me sympathetic smiles. A few even admitted privately that they thought the HOA's decision was unfair, but none of them dared to speak up publicly. One evening, as I sorted through the chaos in my storage unit, I stumbled upon an old photo album buried under a pile of someone else's junk. Flipping through its pages brought back memories I hadn't thought about in years. Family vacations, birthday parties, holidays spent laughing until our sides hurt. These weren't just objects, they were pieces of my life. And now, thanks to the HOA, they were crammed into corners, covered in dust, and surrounded by strangers' belongings. As I sat there holding the album, tears welled up in my eyes. This wasn't just about losing space. It was about losing myself. Every box represented a chapter of my story, and now those chapters were being erased, replaced by things that meant nothing to me. I couldn't let it continue. Something inside me clicked. Maybe Mark was right. I didn't need most of this stuff anymore. But if I was going to let it go, I wasn't going to hand it over to the HOA or their entitled neighbors. No, I needed a plan, a way to take back control and prove a point. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, an idea began to form. What if I turned the tables on them? What if I gave them exactly what they wanted, but on my terms? It was risky, maybe even crazy, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If they believed my storage unit was expendable, why not show them just how disposable it really was? And in the process, I might be able to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. The idea that had been simmering in my mind began to take shape, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. If the HOA thought my storage unit was nothing more than a convenient dumping ground for their things, then I'd make sure they got exactly what they deserved. But this time, I wouldn't play by their rules. I'd rewrite them entirely. The plan was simple yet bold. I would donate everything inside the storage unit to charity. Every single item, whether it belonged to me or to the neighbors who had invaded my space, would be gone. It was a risky move, but the thought of watching their faces when they realized what had happened gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. I started by calling a local charity organization that specialized in helping families in need. When I explained my situation, they were thrilled at the prospect of receiving such a large donation. "We'll send a truck over as soon as possible," the woman on the phone said cheerfully. "Thank you so much for thinking of us." Her enthusiasm made me feel good about my decision, even though I knew it would cause chaos in the neighborhood. Still, I couldn't bring myself to care. The HOA had crossed a line, and now it was time for them to face the consequences. Before the charity arrived, I drafted a letter to the HOA board. In clear, straightforward language, I informed them of my intentions. Effective immediately, I was donating the contents of my storage unit to charity. If they wanted the space for their own use, they could have it. All of it. I didn't mention names or point fingers. I simply stated the facts. Then I printed out copies of the letter and taped them to the doors of every neighbor whose belongings were currently taking up space in my unit. Let them figure it out. The day the charity truck pulled into my driveway felt surreal. Volunteers began unloading boxes and bags, stacking them neatly onto the truck. Word spread quickly, and soon curious neighbors gathered outside to watch. At first, there was confusion. People whispered to each other, trying to understand what was happening. But as the volunteers carried out familiar items, the whispers turned into shouts. "That's mine," one woman exclaimed, pointing at a box filled with winter coats. "What are you doing with my stuff?" "Your stuff," I replied coolly, crossing my arms. "Funny. I don't remember giving you permission to store it here." Another man rushed forward, grabbing a toolbox from a volunteer's hands. "This is my drill," he protested. "You can't just give it away." "Actually," I said, raising an eyebrow, "I can." And I did. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before using someone else's property without asking." The scene quickly descended into chaos. Neighbors argued with each other, accusing one another of piling too many things into my storage unit. Some tried to intervene, demanding that the volunteers stop loading the truck. Others stood back, shaking their heads in disbelief. Through it all, I remained calm, watching the drama unfold with a mix of amusement and vindication. Mrs. Wexler showed up halfway through the commotion, her usual composed demeanor replaced by thinly veiled panic. She marched straight up to me, her face red with anger. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, gesturing wildly at the truck. "You had no right to do this." "Oh, really?" I shot back, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "And you had every right to let people dump their junk in my storage unit without consulting me. Funny how the rules only apply when it suits you." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For once, she looked genuinely rattled, unsure of how to handle the situation. Meanwhile, the volunteers continued working, completely unfazed by the chaos around them. By the time the truck was fully loaded, nearly everyone in the neighborhood had gathered to witness the spectacle. Some looked embarrassed, others furious, but a few seemed almost impressed. As the truck drove away, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The storage unit was finally empty, stripped of its clutter and its baggage. But I knew this was far from over. The HOA wasn't going to let me get away with this without a fight. And while part of me dreaded what might come next, another part couldn't wait to see how they'd respond. After all, sometimes the best way to stand up for yourself is to turn the tables and leave them scrambling to pick up the pieces. The fallout from my decision to donate everything in the storage unit was swift and explosive. By the time the charity truck disappeared down the street, word had spread like wildfire through Willow Creek. Neighbors who hadn't been there to witness the scene firsthand were now bombarding me with questions, accusations, and demands for explanations. Some were furious, others bewildered, but almost everyone seemed to agree on one thing: I had crossed a line. Mrs. Wexler wasted no time calling an emergency HOA meeting. The community center was packed that evening, filled with tense faces and murmured conversations. As I walked in, I could feel dozens of eyes boring into me, some glaring, some curious, and a few almost admiring. I took a seat near the back, steeling myself for what was sure to be a heated confrontation. Mrs. Wexler stood at the front of the room, her usual polished demeanor replaced by thinly veiled frustration. "This is unacceptable," she began, her voice sharp enough to silence the crowd. "What Ms. Carter has done is not only disrespectful, but also completely against the spirit of our community. She had no right to dispose of items belonging to other residents. I raised my hand before she could continue. When she reluctantly acknowledged me, I stood up, my heart pounding but my voice steady. Actually, I said, I had every right. Those items were stored in my property without my permission. If they were so important to you, maybe you should have asked before dumping them there. My words sparked an uproar. People shouted over each other, pointing fingers and airing grievances. One man accused me of ruining his plans to sell his treadmill online. A woman complained that her Christmas decorations were now gone, leaving her unprepared for the holidays. Someone else yelled about how inconvenient it was to lose their seasonal clothes. The room devolved into chaos, with Mrs. Wexler struggling to regain control. But amidst the anger, something unexpected happened. A few voices began to rise above the noise, not to criticize me, but to question the HOA itself. An older gentleman named Mr. Peterson stood up, leaning heavily on his cane. "Let's not forget why this whole mess started," he said, his tone firm but calm. "The HOA decided to take over someone's private property without even asking. That's not leadership. That's bullying." His words struck a chord. Other residents nodded in agreement, emboldened by his courage. A young mother chimed in, saying, "We've let the HOA make decisions for us for too long. Maybe it's time we spoke up for ourselves instead of blindly following their rules." For the first time, cracks appeared in the HOA's carefully constructed image of authority. Mrs. Wexler looked flustered, glancing around the room as if searching for allies. But many of the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact with both her and the crowd. It was clear that my actions had ignited a spark, a growing realization among the residents that they didn't have to accept everything the HOA dictated. As the meeting dragged on, emotions ran high, but I felt a strange sense of vindication. For years, I'd believed I was powerless against the HOA's iron grip. Now I saw that I wasn't alone. There were others who felt just as frustrated, just as trapped, and just as eager for change. My bold move hadn't just challenged the HOA. It had given people permission to question the status quo. When the meeting finally ended, I left feeling drained but hopeful. The battle was far from over, and I knew there would be consequences for what I'd done. But for the first time, I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself. By standing up to the HOA, I had opened the door for others to do the same. And maybe, just maybe, Willow Creek could become a place where fairness and respect mattered more than rules and control. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the events of the day in my mind. Donating the contents of my storage unit had been a drastic step, but it had forced people to confront uncomfortable truths. The HOA might still try to retaliate, but I was ready. Whatever came next, I knew I wouldn't face it alone. The days following the explosive HOA meeting were a whirlwind of tension and transformation. The neighborhood buzzed with conversations about what had happened, and it seemed like everyone had an opinion. Some neighbors avoided me altogether, casting furtive glances in my direction when they thought I wasn't looking. Others approached me cautiously, offering quiet words of support or sharing stories of their own frustrations with the HOA. It was strange being at the center of so much attention, but it also showed me that I wasn't alone in feeling stifled by the rules. Mrs. Wexler and the HOA board didn't take long to respond. Within 2 days, I received another formal letter, this one more pointed than the last. They accused me of willful destruction of community property and warned that legal action might follow if I didn't rectify the situation. What exactly did rectify mean? Return all the donated items, apologize for standing up to them. The vagueness of their threats only made me angrier. They weren't interested in solutions. They just wanted to intimidate me into submission. But something unexpected happened. Not everyone rallied behind the HOA. A small group of neighbors began meeting secretly at each other's homes to discuss what could be done. Mr. Peterson, the elderly man who had spoken out during the meeting, became the unofficial leader of this coalition. He invited me to join them one evening, and as I sat in his cozy living room, surrounded by people who shared my concerns, I felt a renewed sense of hope. These weren't troublemakers or rebels. They were ordinary residents tired of being treated like children by an overbearing organization. "We need to push back," Mr. Peterson said firmly, his voice steady despite his age. "This isn't just about your storage unit. It's about setting boundaries. If we don't stand up now, they'll keep pushing until there's nothing left of our freedom." Over the next few weeks, we worked together to draft petitions, gather signatures, and document instances where the HOA had overstepped its authority. We shared our findings with local news outlets, hoping to shine a light on the injustices happening in Willow Creek. To my surprise, the story gained traction quickly. Reporters interviewed us, asking questions about how the HOA operated and why so many residents felt powerless to challenge them. For the first time, the board members found themselves under public scrutiny, and they didn't handle it well. Mrs. Wexler tried to downplay the controversy, dismissing our complaints as exaggerations or misunderstandings. But her usual charm failed to win people over this time. More and more residents began speaking out, sharing their own stories of frustration. One family revealed how the HOA had fined them repeatedly for minor infractions, forcing them to sell their home. Another recounted how they'd been pressured into removing a tree that had sentimental value because it blocked the view of a neighbor. Each story added fuel to the fire, turning isolated grievances into a collective demand for change. Meanwhile, the charity donation continued to make waves. The organization sent me photos of families receiving the items, a mother holding up a warm winter coat for her child, a teenager grinning as he assembled the treadmill someone had abandoned in my storage unit. Seeing those images reminded me why I'd done what I did. Those belongings may have held little meaning to some of my neighbors, but to others, they were lifelines. Knowing that my act of defiance had helped people in need gave me strength to keep fighting. As momentum grew, the HOA's grip on the community began to weaken. Board members resigned one by one, citing personal reasons or claiming they no longer had time for the role. Mrs. Wexler clung to her position stubbornly, but even she couldn't ignore the growing tide of dissent. At a follow-up meeting, she announced plans to restructure the HOA's policies, promising greater transparency and resident involvement. It sounded hollow, like damage control rather than genuine reform, but it was a start. By now, my storage unit stood empty, its shelves bare and its corners free of clutter. Strangely enough, I didn't feel the urge to fill it again right away. Letting go of those possessions and watching the chaos unfold had taught me something valuable. Sometimes, you have to clear out the old to make room for the new. And while the battle with the HOA wasn't fully won yet, I knew we were heading in the right direction. Together, we were reclaiming Willow Creek, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who called it home. As the weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of my decision to donate everything in the storage unit continued to spread throughout Willow Creek. The HOA's attempts to regain control were clumsy and desperate, but they no longer carried the weight they once did. Residents who had previously stayed silent out of fear or apathy now found their voices, emboldened by the growing movement for change. What started as a personal act of defiance had transformed into something much bigger, a collective pushback against years of unchecked authority. The coalition led by Mr. Peterson grew stronger with each passing day. We held regular meetings, not just to strategize, but also to support one another. People shared stories about how the HOA's rigid rules had impacted their lives, how fines, threats, and arbitrary decisions had made them feel powerless. One woman recounted how she'd been forced to repaint her front door because it was too bright, even though it brought her joy every time she came home. Another man talked about how he'd stopped hosting backyard barbecues after being fined for having too many cars parked on his street during family gatherings. These stories bonded us together, fueling our determination to create a fairer, more inclusive community. Meanwhile, the media coverage kept the pressure on the HOA. Local newspapers published investigative pieces exposing questionable practices, such as excessive fines and selective enforcement of rules. One reporter uncovered documents showing that several board members had waived fees for friends while cracking down harshly on others. The revelations shocked many residents, including some who had blindly trusted the HOA for years. Slowly but surely, public opinion shifted. Neighbors who had once dismissed me as a troublemaker began thanking me for standing up when no one else would. Mrs. Wexler tried to fight back, organizing informational sessions to clear up misunderstandings and reassure residents that the HOA only wanted what was best for everyone. But her polished speeches fell flat. At one meeting, a young father stood up and asked why the HOA prioritized aesthetics over practicality, pointing out that strict landscaping rules made it nearly impossible for families with limited budgets to maintain their yards. Another neighbor questioned why the board refused to disclose financial records, accusing them of operating without accountability. Mrs. Wexler struggled to respond, her usual confidence replaced by visible discomfort. Amidst all this, I couldn't help reflecting on how much had changed, not just in the neighborhood, but within myself. Before this ordeal, I'd always been someone who avoided conflict, preferring to keep my head down and go along with the flow. But standing up to the HOA had awakened a part of me I hadn't known existed. I realized that fighting for what's right isn't about being fearless. It's about finding courage despite your fears. And seeing others join the cause reminded me that real change happens when people come together, united by a shared purpose. Still, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, as I lay awake thinking about everything that had happened, I wondered if I'd gone too far. Had I alienated neighbors? Would the HOA retaliate in ways I couldn't anticipate? Part of me worried that the backlash might still come, lurking just around the corner. But then I'd think about the families helped by the charity donations, the residents inspired to speak up, and the slow but steady dismantling of the HOA's iron grip, and I'd remind myself that it was worth it. By the time spring arrived, Willow Creek felt like a different place. New faces joined the HOA board, replacing those who had resigned under pressure. They'd promised reforms, clearer communication, more input from residents, and a focus on fairness rather than control. While skepticism lingered, there was a palpable sense of hope in the air. For the first time in years, decisions were made collaboratively instead of behind closed doors. My empty storage unit remained untouched for a while, a quiet reminder of where this journey had begun. I didn't rush to fill it again, choosing instead to let it sit as a symbol of liberation. Little by little, I started bringing things back, only the essentials this time, leaving space for possibility. Because sometimes, letting go isn't just about clearing out clutter. It's about making room for growth, both personally and collectively. And in doing so, I discovered that standing up for yourself can lead to something even greater. A chance to build something better, for everyone. By the time summer rolled around, Willow Creek had transformed in ways I never could have imagined. The once oppressive shadow of the HOA had lifted, replaced by a newfound spirit of collaboration and mutual respect. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements, debates, and occasional hiccups. But the community felt lighter, freer. People smiled more, waved hello without hesitation, and actually stopped to chat instead of rushing past each other. For the first time since moving here, I truly felt like I belonged. The storage unit, now mostly empty except for a few tools and seasonal decorations, became a symbol of my journey, a reminder of how far I'd come. Every time I opened its door, I thought about the chaos that had unfolded and the lessons I'd learned along the way. Letting go of those belongings hadn't just cleared physical space, it had cleared emotional space too. I realized that holding on to things out of habit or obligation doesn't always serve us. Sometimes, letting go is what sets us free. But perhaps the most surprising outcome was the connection I'd forged with my neighbors. Before this whole ordeal, I'd known only a handful of people by name. Now, I found myself part of a tight-knit group working together to reshape our community. Mr. Peterson, the elderly man who had sparked the rebellion, became a close friend. He often invited me over for tea, sharing stories from his younger days about standing up to authority figures. "You remind me of myself back then," he said one afternoon, his eyes twinkling. "Stubborn, maybe, but determined to do what's right." Even some of the neighbors who had initially opposed me came around, apologizing for their earlier reactions. One woman, whose Christmas decorations I'd donated, admitted she'd been angry at first, but later understood why I'd done it. "You made us see what we'd been tolerating for too long," she said. "Thank you for shaking things up." Her words stayed with me, a reminder that even the hardest battles can lead to understanding, if not immediately, then eventually. As for Mrs. Wexler, she quietly stepped down from her position as HOA president, citing health reasons. She moved away shortly after, leaving behind an aura of mystery. Some speculated she left because she couldn't handle losing control, while others believed she simply wanted a fresh start. Either way, her departure marked the end of an era and the beginning of something better. The new HOA board worked hard to rebuild trust. They introduced transparent policies, held regular town hall meetings, and encouraged open dialogue between residents. Slowly but surely, the culture of fear dissolved, replaced by a sense of shared responsibility. When disputes arose, they were resolved through conversation rather than punishment. It wasn't always easy, but it was fair, and that made all the difference. Looking back, I realized that donating the contents of my storage unit wasn't just an act of defiance. It was a turning point, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. It forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about power, fairness, and the importance of standing up for oneself. And while the process was messy and exhausting, it ultimately brought us closer together. One evening, as Mark and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. This place, which had once felt so alien and suffocating, now felt like home. The laughter of children playing in the street, the hum of friendly conversations drifting through open windows. It all reminded me of why we'd chosen Willow Creek in the first place. Sure, it had taken a lot of effort to get here, but the reward was worth every challenge. That night, as I tucked myself into bed, I thought about how much I'd grown over the past year. I'd started out feeling powerless, frustrated, and alone, but I'd ended up stronger, braver, and surrounded by people who believed in the same values I did. Standing up to the HOA had taught me that change is possible, even when it feels impossible. All it takes is one person willing to take a stand, and a community ready to follow. Sometimes, life throws challenges your way that seem insurmountable, but if you face them head-on, with courage and conviction, you might just discover something amazing. The power to transform not only your own life, but the lives of those around you. And in doing so, you create a legacy, a story worth telling again and again.